Welcome to the second Focus podcast on mental health and psychosocial support in dynamic integration. This podcast is based on the second Living Well Together online forum that took place on the 21st of June 2021. In part 1, we discussed why and how to overcome the vulnerability framework, which objectifies migrants and often comes with a political agenda in a society that is itself fractured. We saw how community approaches based on a rights and solidarity model are a more holistic, more positive, and more sustainable pathway to integration. In part 2, we discuss how to implement these insights in policymaking and give some practice examples. We are with Alison Strang from Queen Margaret University, Edinburgh, and Guglielmo Schininà from the International Organization for Migration. The discussion is hosted by Dejan Ajduković from the University of Zagreb and by Anouk Boschma and Martha Bird from the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies Reference Centre for Psychosocial Support on behalf of the Focus team.
Now, both of you have presented this compatible, I would say, one building from another psychosocial frameworks, and they all emphasize dynamic integration. Now, how can that be operationalized by our partners in the Focus project? How can they help activate both the arriving and receiving communities, especially those community members who are not involved or necessarily involved in integration or who are critical of it? Guglielmo, would you like to start? And then maybe Alison, you can fill in.
The three elements coexist: the cultural element, the psychological, biopsychological, if you want, element, and the social relational, and socio-economic element coexist. You cannot give a housing without considering what this kind of housing will mean from a social relational point of view, or will mean from a emotional point of view for the person, or also for their culture, if it doesn't correspond to what they're used to or what they would like to become. Our job is done when we are able to look at the three aspects in everything that we do, when we approach people that come from different cultures.
I think Scotland is an interesting case example because it's a context where the political narrative has been very positive towards migrants, particularly refugees, but also, as you'll know, there is a tension between the Scottish devolved Parliament and Westminster, the UK Parliament. So Scotland has had lots of reasons for actually using very positive narratives around inward migration. So just recently, I don't know how far across the globe it reached, but UK government, who are responsible for the asylum process and for removals, did try to remove somebody from housing in Glasgow who had used up all their appeals for asylum. And the whole neighbourhood came out and demonstrated. And it wasn't one of these kind of manufactured demonstrations with activists stirring it up. It started anyway as a genuine neighbourly uprising, which is quite interesting, really, because that was in quite a poor, economically deprived area. But then the other bit that I think we need to really address, and I think that's implicit in your question, Dejan, is how do we involve those people who would otherwise not care? So I do think it's a real priority to look at ways to involve local people in order to build those bridges, which we said are both crucial for integration and crucial for mental health. We have started to look at how you give people practice in language learning by using existing community organizations. So instead of setting up a language group and inviting local volunteers to come and help with it, to approach, we had a group of car mechanics guys who worked in a garage, and then some refugees who were also interested in car mechanics, met with them, learnt the right language, or we've got babies and toddlers groups already existing, and then they were supported, funded, to work with local refugee mothers and toddlers. So it's about it's the principle of solidarity, isn't it? About finding things of mutual interest and building solidarity around shared purpose.
Linking international humanitarian work to long-term international collaboration and peace-building raises new challenges regarding sustainability and the role of government funding.
Sustainability and ownership have been a long-term concern for various projects. How do you think integration projects can be different? Because a lot of the funding for integration projects tends to be quite short-term.
Well, I'm just agreeing that most of the funding is short-term and how frustrating that is in many contexts. And I suppose I feel if we sort of jump to the big question about sustainability, then actually it has to come through empowering and enabling people to take control and be proactive. So that is the sort of ground up response and supporting that. So again, I'm thinking about, how much do even the short-term investment, if we're investing more in refugees and hopefully local people, but people in communities anyway, building up the capacity to influence and shape their own communities, then that does have some more sustainability than very short-term support service provision, which is important too, but there's a lot more funding goes into the latter than the former in my experience.
I think, that probably the problem is the word project, can integration be a project or a series of projects, should it be instead of a system, and tendency, I mean, the issue is why we use the word project is because migration has been perceived more and more as an emergency, and integration, therefore, something to quickly respond to an immediate need, of possible, let's say, social troubles that might then create a negative view, of the arrival of migrants, especially for the political level that is funding in most of these projects. Now, I think, we shouldn't talk about projects. We should talk about something different that is mostly system. And to work on system, you have to work on institutions. So I think, that my effort will be that, don't start only with the nice projects on the field and put people gardening together. But on the other side, look at the institutions, look at what are the gaps and entry points in the institutions and invest heavily on those, because those are services that stay. I think, Alison will be totally in agreement with me on that.
As you were talking, I suppose I was just thinking about the whole challenges of specialist services like some of the ones that you've been describing and mainstreaming. And, that is an old policy challenge. It's not specific to this context at all, but I think it's something we need to be very wary of because there are dangers in going in both directions, and specialist services for refugees in this case, or people from other cultures, are great for lots of those kinds of reasons because they can deliver services and have the resources to address some of the special issues. But then they also tend to cut people off from a more holistic approach to their health, for example, if not handled carefully. And I think, if we're talking about sustainability, I've seen can be very vulnerable to cuts as well because they're seen as an extra. Again, going back to my earlier points about let's not other refugees as opposed to anyone else, but recognize all the dimensions of diversity.
Attitudes, perceptions, and threats are influential indicators of psychosocial integration. But what about expectations? Deep-seated expectations on the side of both arriving and receiving communities may impact their attitude to integration.
So, in summary, how do we deal with expectations on part of the arriving community as well as the receiving community?
It is quite complicated. We deal with this all the time because a lot of the work that we do is instructing in issues of safe migration and the risk of irregular migration. Many people in many countries that are usually origin countries for migrants who tend to travel in situations that put them in big vulnerability, sometimes in vulnerable situations, trafficking, smuggling, exploitation, situation like slavery, and so on and so forth. But the idea is that when you travel, so when you take the risk to travel, when you receive probably money from your family in order to travel, when you feel guilty because you left many people behind to look for a better life, when you arrive at destination, if your life is not as splendid as you thought, but basically the contrary, you tend not to tell this to your family back home, or to your friends back home. You tend to portray a positive experience, what you're facing. So whatever message might come from an institution is not really something that is perceived as reliable. Also because legitimately, they might think that there are vested interests. And on the other side, it's true that this is not all. We said before there is a social relational element, there is a bonding element that is equally important. And our role as psychosocial experts would be, if people have the intention to travel, to prepare them for the challenges that will come along, also from an emotional, psychological, social relational point of view. So this is one thing. Then there are the expectations from the receiving community, expectation of prejudice, if you want, that also have to be counteracted. I don't know if you know Anne Mass. Anne Mass is a linguistic professor that studied a lot how you verbalize the difference between the in-group and out-group. So basically, she realized that whenever you try to give a positive image of someone of the out-group, this is perceived by the in-group as something particular. So basically, you might spend a lot of money and time in saying migrants are great because look at what they contribute, look at what they do. That contribution will be attributed to the single individual. And we saw it. You remember this episode and the peak of the migration crisis in Europe of Syria. Remember that citizen was given to these people who were not jumping in a river to save someone or climbing a building to save a child. This is the exceptional. By contrary, if someone from the migrant community, by coincidence, drunk, killed someone with the car, that will be attributed to the entire community. What is the solution? I don't know. So it's something that we are struggling with quite a lot, and probably we'll have to find it. But the public communication in this sense is quite difficult.
I suppose if I can add anything, it would be again around that kind of grassroots end of things, as we've been exploring, that once there is this in-group, out-group view built up, then there are resistances. As we know, there are resistances to changing your mind about anything, but the evidence suggests that it is personal interaction that gradually erodes those stereotypes. And there's interesting work around everyday conviviality. And we know, for example, that schools are a great context of attitude change generally in society, but integration in particular. And one does see interesting innovations from schools to try and expand their influence beyond the children in the classroom to the families. And that strikes me as a really positive way to go, because there's a shared identity, and that takes us right back to that issue of solidarity, I guess, at the beginning.
I just want to share a little piece of our research related to the expectancies. Well, we did focus groups and we did major surveys. And what came out is that receiving community members expect the refugees to put an effort to become members of the community. And the refugees said that they expect the receiving community members to help them do that. So the level of expectation, I think, comes from very high level down to what Alison was saying, to the direct interactions. And both the groups said that they would expect the refugees to show the effort or intention to stay and start building their life. They both see that when there is lack of that as a major obstacle for mutual perceptions and relations at the higher levels. So it's the bridges in that aspect as well.
Before moving on to the focus approach, Deanne, Alison, and Guglielmo share their key takeaways from the discussion.
For me, it's reassuring to hear the anti-vulnerability perspective and the perspective of the healthy populations that we work with who are having a hard time because of their past, but also of who we are and how do we work with them.
We've really played around quite appropriately with both the highest of high levels and the very grassroots, as well as the short term and the long term. And we have to keep embracing all those things. We really have to be clever about thinking, how do we create pathways that deliver now, but lay the groundwork, create those environments, those attitudes of solidarity that we know are needed for the long term. I mean, this is a depressing time to be talking about this, isn't it? As we all see our political agendas going in the opposite direction. But for me, yeah, I think it has to be about that grassroots humanity. And I am encouraged by the little bursts that there are from different communities around the world reacting against the oppression of the othering.
In general, I think probably, from what all of us have said, the importance of considering mental health and psychosocial support. Psychosocial support not only as a service for one person, but really as an informing logic of what can come from all the different aspects of integration. A way to conceptualize the different realms of integration, looking at them as a composite of social, cultural, and psychological elements.
The Focus project has also identified some leads on what matters and what works in integration. Martha Bird and Anouk Boschma introduce us to this Focus approach to dynamic integration.
One of the things that we've been trying to look at in Focus, and it sits somewhere between the things that we've been talking about today, is not to raise your expectations, but I'm going to anyway, is this aspect of the very quick turnover on integration projects, and then how can you actually work more systematically and purposefully to skip across those projects and do something as an organization that has some more sustainability, some more longevity. And the second part is that trying to see how we can get from our research to our practice and answer that very difficult question that we've been trying to answer today. What does this thing that we can say philosophically, that we can see in research is problematic, how does that translate into some kind of positive action? And we're trying to put ourselves a little bit in between those two levels and look at something that we're for now calling the Focus approach.
We try to frame our approach to dynamic integration within this indicators of integration conceptual framework that Alison just presented as much as possible. And we also try to look at the dynamics between these indicators and these concepts and how practitioners from government and civil society, including refugee diaspora organizations, might I add, can address these dynamics in their day-to-day work. And we hope to encourage you to also do so the coming year as we are developing our resource, as we call it in our approach. We decided to, instead of establishing a toolbox with a conundrum of single best practices, to develop a broader approach to address the sustainability issue that was mentioned, but also the community development approach that Alison highlighted in her work as well, as there's no single practice that solves integration, as it's a very complex societal matter. Rather, integration like MHBSS requires a multi-layered, well-coordinated response, serving holistic needs of individuals, families, and communities as a whole. First of all, arriving and receiving communities. As you may have noticed in this webinar, we do call refugees and host communities arriving and receiving communities, and we do that very deliberately. As arriving community members can and will become part of the receiving community if integration works well, highlighting the dynamic between social bonds and bridges, as well as focusing on the dynamic relationship between communities, rather than boxing people as refugees and host communities, also stepping away slightly from that vulnerability framework that we addressed. Part of that pillar, we tried to include volunteerism. That may become part of this pillar or be a pillar on its own, reflecting the role of active voluntary participation in dynamic integration work by both arriving and receiving community members. For instance, Red Cross Red Crescent community volunteers, but also community-based initiatives, as we have seen a lot of those since 2015 and before, but also refugee-led initiatives that are supporting other refugees. You will have noticed a lot in the presentations and the discussions between Guli, Alison, and Dejan that the vulnerability framework can be countered by a more empowering narrative, where we really focus on participation. And we have to start that by doing that in our own work, first of all. We cannot just preach to the choir, in a sense. Thirdly, I'll address very shortly multi-stakeholder partnerships and coordination, which focuses on the coordination and establishment or maintenance of partnerships between civil society and community-based initiatives, next to the role of local, regional, national, or even European or continental government, and including private sector partners as well. Together, these partnerships and the coordination supports in creating access to jobs, to housing, education, to also to the social links aspect. And finally, mental health and psychosocial support, which was the topic of today's discussions in relation to dynamic integration. As you can tell from what I just outlined, MHPSS is a response to a societal need, as Gulli also addressed, and it's truly cross-cutting in that sense. Mental health, as Gulli also said, it's not mystical, and it should be demystified in this sense. It's not a separate aspect of health, as Alison also highlighted, and not just an individual matter, but rather an outcome of individual, family, and community factors, and requires a focus also on psychosocial support. And we therefore truly believe that MHPSS requires this community-based approach, taking into regard the needs, wants, and rights of arriving and receiving community members and families. And we hope, and this is how I will conclude, that we can include your perspective as we embark on the final stage of our project in developing this implementation guidance, how to do this in practice.
And that's it from our side. Thank you so much for taking your time to join us. And I hope you have a nice afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you are. And be safe, everyone. Thank you so much.
On this note, we would like to close this Focus podcast on mental health and psychosocial support in dynamic integration. We hope you enjoyed it, and we look forward to welcoming you to the next Focus Forum. For further information, check the Focus website and sign up to our newsletter.